Good day, everyone. Depending on where you are around the globe, here in Saskatchewan, Canada, it is 2:30 p.m. My name is Jane Ekman. I am a PhD candidate at the Johnson Shuyama Graduate School of Public Policy, the University of Regina in Saskatchewan, Canada. Welcome again to the Canadian Association for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies Conference in 2021. In this year's conference, scholars, practitioners, and experts converged to reflect on the transformative potential of utopic thinking and practices in forced migration studies. I will be coordinating this 90-minute session that focuses on reflections around justice and fairness for refugees. We'll have 4 presenters today. We have Mehmoona Musamira, Madison Gonzalez, we have Nafees Ahmad, Melisa Martinez. These presenters are from different universities and research centers globally, and we're very much happy to have them. Our first presenter today is Mamuna Musamira. I will be introducing her before she commences her presentation. Mehmoona has worked for many years with children and their families, particularly in inner city poor areas populated with people from visible minority community. Her research interests include anti-oppressive practice and teaching, children's rights, and child welfare practice and policy. Mehmoona, you're welcome to commence the presentation.
Thank you very much, Jane. Hello, everyone. Okay, so this is more of a theoretical paper on trauma and understanding it using a decolonial lens. So normative understandings of trauma, dominant discourses of trauma are grounded within Euro-American contexts using a Eurocentric framework that is capitalist, modernist, and understands trauma largely through scientific and medical discourses. Contemporary understandings of trauma as psychological injury can be traced to 19th century Europe at the inception of the industrial age. People were exposed to new risks, such as those associated with mechanized travel, warfare, and working with heavy-duty machinery, resulting in accidents or anxiety that caused psychological distress along with physical injury. More contemporarily, the Holocaust, the US wars on Vietnam, and the War on Terror, the 2 world wars, resulting in large numbers of veterans and survivors experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, has made this concept of trauma much popular lately. And it reached its apex when it got included in the PTSD, when PTSD got included as a nervous disorder in this DSM. Meanwhile, from the mid-1980s, trauma was claimed by and became a signifier for a politics of recognition and belonging within feminist, anti-racist, and other theorists of marginalized groups who sought to realign their understanding of pain that they experience as a result of various types of exclusion and violence, which they labeled as traumatic. So my point is that the meaning of trauma is unstable and dependent on context in which it's used. However, dominant understandings of trauma commonly continue to adhere to the traditional event-based model of trauma, according to which trauma results from a single extraordinary catastrophic event and recovery takes the form of a talking cure. And this is what I'm challenging using a decolonial analysis of trauma. Historically, the figure of Frantz Fanon, a Caribbean-born Black psychiatrist who wrote and practiced in colonized Algeria in the 1950s, played a foundational role in theorizing trauma using a decolonial perspective. Fanon challenged the dominant biopsychic model adopted by most psychiatrists, positing an alternative model for understanding trauma, which he labeled as a sociogenic model of trauma that paid attention to the social context and lived experiences of people living with trauma. The social context was important for Fanon because in examining it, the agent of violence or perpetrator of trauma could be revealed, which he identified as being the post-colonial state. So colonization itself, according to Fanon, is traumatizing. Colonial violence affects the psychic and affective domains, reaching to the innermost areas of subjectivity. For Fanon, both the colonizer and the colonized experience trauma through colonization, which is experienced as a deeply alienating phenomena that depends on the colonizer's need to engage in violent practices enforcing their superiority, while the colonized is at the receiving end of violence. The event that may trigger trauma, therefore, is in fact representative of something much bigger. It is in the political climate where the trauma is induced. That is where that is a site of trauma, not the event itself. By political, Fanon meant all the mechanisms and practices, material, epistemological, imaginary, literary, scientific, and other resources that were put to use by the colonizer, which the colonizer used to control and crown the subject as subjugated. So in summary, according to decolonial theorists, trauma as a colonial construct is modernist, understood within a biopsychic medical model. It uses pseudoscience to explain the hysteria of the colonized masses, attributed to their assumed inferiority and limitations of their brain. That's how it has been understood in the literature, even now. It is also capitalist because it attempts largely to assimilate the other in order to integrate the other back to an unjust environment that is dominated by relations of commodification. It is racist, and its racialized nature has meant that while the colonizer can leave the place where practices of colonization is forcing them into practices that they can't live with, practices of subjugation, the colonized cannot leave that environment. And so it is an unequal relationship that both colonizers and colonized experience, but in different ways. So there are three implications to understanding trauma in this way, using a decolonial analysis that I'd like to go over. The first is culture, the second is intergenerational trauma, and the final is the post-colonial nation state. So culture. So using Fanon's idea of examining the political climate that is the source of trauma, results in examining and understanding the politics of culture in colonized and settler colonial societies. Westphalian nation states are built on the idea of singular monolithic national culture and race, the assumption that all Canadians enjoy one kind of culture and that all Canadians are understood as being white. Other cultures, such as those of the colonized, are viewed as a threat because of their alterity or their inassimilability. Culture as a source of trauma and a target of violence is common to the history of colonization transnationally. It remains a site of trauma and violence, even within contemporary post-settler colonial societies that replace the colonizer elite with their own elite groups. So if we were going to look at, apply this kind of analysis about culture and trauma in the case of refugee newcomers, who in recent years are likely to have arrived from Muslim majority countries, such as Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, and so on, the fact of the war on terror that Canada also participated in after 9/11 and the subsequent radicalization of a minority of Muslim youth has resulted in both the secretization of the Canadian state as well as a sharp rise in Islamophobia. So that is the nature of the political culture within which Muslims arrive. Surveillance of young Muslim men rise, the rise in police brutality, the murders of Muslim people, such as that of the recent murder in London, Ontario, stands as a testament to the pervasiveness of anti-Muslim sentiment in Canada. For the most part, it is those people who wear or identify as Muslims, both culturally and in terms of their avowed faith, that are the target for racist attacks. So, for example, women wearing hijabs or men wearing skull caps. These are cultural markers that mark them as being Muslim, and therefore they become the target of violence. These are experienced as deeply traumatic events, obviously, particularly by the Muslim community and the refugee newcomers who have left the places where they came from to flee from similar kinds of violence. And they record, there are many studies that show that they say that the trauma they suffer upon hearing about their Muslim brethren being killed is experiences even more traumatic than the condition which they fled. That's just an example of how culture can be a site of trauma. Intergenerational trauma, and I'll be quick, trauma that is the result of colonization is experienced intergenerationally globally. All colonized communities talk about that. And unlike normative models, trauma is not understood in an individualist term, which it is generally. Here it is understood as colonial injury. It's understood as a collective experience. It is looked at in terms of its cumulative effects and its cross-generational impacts. So rather than just centering the mother-child dyad, which is often the case in normative theories, all the actors in society are involved and acknowledged as both producers and receivers of trauma. And addressing trauma is about addressing it collectively. The last piece that I want to talk about in terms of the political environment is nation states. Nation states are a colonial invention. They consist of a Westphalian state, the political philosophy of liberalism, the development of democracy, and the modern capitalist order, which are all centered on Europe. So the nation state, as we know it, is a European phenomena. This European phenomena is monoracial, monoreligious, and monocultural. And it and modern colonialism were born together and are mutually co-constituted. An enduring legacy of colonialism in post-colonial society has been the ad hoc creation or organization of space into nation states where none existed before, with its accompanying idea of a monoracial, monocultural, and monoreligious elite, replacing the white colonial elites during the time of direct rule. So this is the legacy of colonialism. And it provides an important context to understanding the circumstances from which many refugees are fleeing. And when we are assessing trauma in refugee newcomers using a decolonial analysis, it's therefore very important that we assess the pre-migration the migratory journey, as well as the post-migration experiences of trauma, rather than just the post-migration or the pre-migration experiences of trauma and its impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. I would have mentioned this ground rules from the beginning, quite subtle guide for questions. Thank you very much, Mona. If you have some questions, I would advise that you put the questions on the chats, and you also can present, you can also ask your questions verbally, but we would advise that you ask those questions after the full presentation so that we can keep to time. So our next presenter today is Madison Gonzalez. Madison is a graduate research assistant on the Story Modelers team at the Virginia Modeling, Analysis, and Simulation Center. And that center is funded by the Maneuver Research Initiatives. Her team focuses on the absorptive capacity of host communities receiving migrants to provide insights on social stability in the wake of extreme events such as environmental crisis, sudden population increases, or pandemic. And her research focuses on South Africa, and she seeks to navigate how access to water security shapes instances of social conflicts. So we welcome Madison to do her presentation today. Welcome, Madison.
Hello, thank you for that introduction. So as Jane was just saying, at the research lab that I'm a part of, VMASC in Norfolk, Virginia, we analyze the absorptive capacity of host communities receiving displaced populations. And as part of this research, we have sought to understand the cross-contextual situations of informal settlements. So this is just a quick overview of everything that I will be covering today from our case study selection, the literature review regarding informal settlements, our methodological process, and then an analysis of informal settlements. So informal settlements face 5 main challenges, which includes legal insecurity, access to safe water, sanitation and services, housing fragility, and extreme overcrowding. So there are more than 1 billion people around the world that currently live in informal settlements. And this number is continuously growing, where in 2030, the United Nations expects 3 billion people around the world to be living in informal settlements. So this is a situation of extreme urban poverty that impacts a large portion of the global population. This research originally started as we have absorbed displaced populations originally in Colombia, and trying to understand how the lived experiences of informal settlements in Colombia translate to other situations such as that in South Africa, which is one of our another case study locations for our research. So we have selected 2 informal settlements, one in Colombia and one in South Africa. So in Colombia, we look at Villa Caracas, which is in Barranquilla, Colombia. And there are around 3,350 people living in this informal settlement. So this is largely internally displaced Colombians and also displaced Venezuelans. In these areas, or in this informal settlement, there is extreme crime rates and then also extreme weather events that threaten these communities. They also have poor quality housing and lack access to essential services. However, we find that despite these challenges, residents work together to address their community needs. In South Africa, we look at the township and informal settlement of Khayelitsha, which is on the outskirts of Cape Town. Here, it is estimated that there are about 1.5 million people living here. However, the numbers are uncertain considering the rapid growth within this community. And this community is made up of majority Black residents in South Africa that host rural to urban migrants from other provinces. This community in particular is a hotspot for what is called service delivery protest and also of xenophobic violence. As I said, for Via Caracas and Kailicha, they also suffer from having poor quality housing and a lack of access to essential services. In this community in particular, we find that residents experience in-group solidarity and hostility towards perceived outsiders, which is frequently the government. So for informal settlements, we have identified two schools of thought. The first one is comprised of those who see informal settlements as an issue that can and must be solved. So this largely comes from the idea that informal settlements are a location for the overflows of population. So this is mostly criminals, displaced populations, and also the impoverished. So this has given rise to ideas such as the UN statement for the elimination of urban poverty, which has created the idea that these informal settlements can be eradicated. Our research falls more in line with the second school of thought that finds that informal settlements are a rich place for social mobilization and agency, as individuals act on their own behalf to create their own living space by any means possible. We also find that informal settlements are a transitionary point for forcefully displaced populations who now use informal settlements as a place for them to adapt into their new community. So our methodology has been comprised of in-country interviews. So in South Africa, we have conducted 26 interviews with public works agencies and civil society organizations. And in Colombia, there have been, I believe, 22 interviews with public works agencies and civil society organizations. So through these interviews, we have spoken with individuals who have close relationships with informal settlement communities, who have brought attention to the challenges that these communities face. However, this methodological process does have its limitations. I worked very closely with the South Africa interviews, and one problem that we came across here was the limited access to internet. So this made conducting these interviews a very challenging process. However, we did overcome this through our trial and error process to figure out what best way to contact individuals living in informal settlements. However, this was also an ethical concern that we needed to overcome in our process. So now I'm going to give you a quick introduction to our informal settlement analysis in a cross-contextual setting. So first, we have found that a long history of displacement has contributed to the growth of informal settlement populations. In Colombia, more than 50 years of civil armed conflict has displaced more than 9 million Colombians, many of those who fled to the neighboring country, Venezuela. However, now as Venezuela faces its own migration situation, Colombia is now receiving those international displaced populations as well. South Africa then faced 47 years of apartheid era rule that forcefully segregated populations and forcefully removed them to the urban periphery and also into rural areas. So now that the apartheid era is over 27 years ago, South Africa sees very rapid urbanization rates where those who were previously displaced now move towards urban areas for opportunity, leading to the emergence of informal settlements and what they regard as the land grab situation in South Africa. So looking at the graph on the screen, which we created from the SDG indicators database, we show in 2015 for Colombia, there's a very steep increase in the amount of the population living in informal settlements following the onset of the migration crisis. So for South Africa, while they have been formalizing informal homes, we find that rapid urbanization exceeds the capabilities of the government to keep up with this growing population and has then led to the rapid growth of informal settlements in South Africa. So in both of these locations, we find that there are both infrastructural and environmental concerns. Informal settlements are typically located on environmentally degraded land. And so there tends to be a cycle of environmental damage done to the area that they're located on, but also how these environmental concerns have a negative impact on the population. So oftentimes we find that because of a lack of infrastructure, residents must act on their own behalf to create toilets or watering holes and things like that, that then also have a negative impact on the environment and on the community themselves as well, as they try to overcome their precarious situation. However, we find that despite these challenges, communities organize themselves through solidaric measures to overcome these challenges. So these first two bullets, I have two quotes from interviews with community leaders in Villa Caracas, which is the informal settlement in Colombia. And so through this interview, the community leader explained to us that when the community did not have access to electricity, the individuals took it upon themselves to connect those community members to electricity. Then once the police and the electric company came in to try to take that service away from them, the community members pretty much built a human wall to stop them from coming in and taking this away from them. And so this service now still remains there because of the community's solidarity to maintain this infrastructure for themselves. Then in South Africa, we find that informal residents are largely reliant upon their community members to join in solidaric protest action against the various threats to their survival. So through this, we show that community members fill the gaps that the government has left behind in providing services to these communities. Furthermore, through these interviews, we have also identified that crime and safety is a major challenge that these communities face. So armed conflict still goes on in Colombia, which continues to internally displace populations, leading to more informal settlement residents. Then also through our interviews with those in South Africa, they have pointed to the fact that high youth unemployment rates in the townships and informal settlements leads to increased criminal activity. So showing another threat to community safety in these areas. So despite this, we have identified that a long history of displacement in both country contexts has contributed to the growth of informal settlements. But despite the challenges that these areas face, migrants do still choose to reside here. We have found that this is largely because other housing opportunities are too expensive. So informal settlements provide a way for these populations to adapt as they slowly move into a more sustainable area of living. We also argue that informal settlements are likely to persist as population growth outpaces the government's ability to respond to these populations' needs. So these communities pose both a challenge and create opportunities for utopic communities of belonging and civic engagement. So this was shown as community members identify together and act against the various threats to them. However, this does pose a challenge to their daily well-being and the precarious situations that they're forced to live in. But despite all of these challenges, this goes to show how communities are able to adapt in the face of the various challenges to their well-being. At this point, I would ask for questions, but we will save those for the end. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Martins, for such an insightful presentation. Thank you. So our next presenter today is Nafees Ahmad. Nafees Ahmad is a senior assistant professor at the Faculty of Legal Studies, South Asian University in New Delhi. He holds a doctorate in international refugee law and human rights. His area of scholarship focuses on refugees, migrants, the role of artificial intelligence in refugee protection, international politics of asylum, migration, global forced displacement, global migration governance, and climate refugees in South Asia. He also addresses climate change-driven human displacement, refugee policy, invisible fairness of asylum, disconnects of durable solutions, and You need to tell us what SAARC means. SAARC connects and context of refugee protection. So Dr. Ahmad has actually authored and co-authored several publications, including a book on climate refugees in South Asia, published by one of his publishers, is Springer. So I'll welcome Nafees Ahmad to commence his presentation. But I'd like to know what SAARC is, SAARC. You're welcome, Nafees.
That is a South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. It's an intergovernmental organization, man, that has been recognized by the United Nations organization that came into existence in 1985. And there are 8 jurisdictions are there, consisting of this, regional cooperation group, that is Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, India, Maldives, Bhutan, and Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. So these are the 8 jurisdictions which constitute SAARC. That is, it's an abbreviation, acronym. Thank you very much, ma'am, for a very generous introduction of mine. I immensely thankful to your organization for inviting and accepting my presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, my presentation, the title of my presentation, the topic of my presentation is Underlying Universal Underpinnings for Just and Across the Board Treatment of Refugees, Decolonizing the Accomplishment of Global Utopia of Peace. I would be operating my intellectual submissions, my conceptual framework within the architecture of the idea of global justice or global peace. Thereafter, I would be assessing issues and challenges to peace within the framework of the United Nations Charter, particularly the preamble to the United Nations Charter, and thereafter the principal universal foundations for just and across the border treatment of refugees. So there are certain important streams within which we have to understand the idea of peace, and that is one of the most important quests for the entire refugeehood and the refugee population, or planet refugee, I should call it. Principal universal foundations of peace, there is a declaration on peace as well that has been sponsored by the United Nations organization. Then we have to locate the idea of peace within the rubrics of international law, international refugee law, and into global, what we call, compacts on refugees and migrations, and international, humanitarian law framework as well. Madam Chair, peace is a pilgrimage to troubled territories, and refugee mobility is a migration for global utopia of peace. Refugee exodus is driven by the utopia of peace, and they set on the path of utopia of peace as the ambassadors of peace in search of peace. They try to locate the utopia of peace in transcontinental terrains, intercontinental spaces, and transnational lands away from their roots, origins, and sources. Madam Chair, primarily refugees are disposed or dispossessed of their right to belong and right to have rights in transcendental terra firma and constitutional magnum opus in the geopolitical entities of belongers and non-belongers alike. Refugees have been weaving and vouching for the accomplishment of global utopia of peace as a part of their across the board treatment based on the underlying universal underpinnings of justice. Justice in the sense of international law, regional protections, national receptions, structural, institutional, and transcendental structural justice. The contemporary refugee protection framework represents certain important dimensions, particularly the humanitarian compromises and colonial legacies in the post-Second World War. Such a refugee protection framework needs to be decolonized beyond the existing trajectory of durable solutions. The perception about refugees has been too often of them being a liability on the host state. but they have never been regarded as an asset to the world community. In the reception countries, Madam Chair, the refugees have been perceived as a threat to national integrity, internal security, and political stability. Instead, they confront hostile environments. Therefore, the refugee policies invariably of all countries do not envision any space for their services in the nation building projects. However, 2018 UN Global Compacts on Refugees and Migration provide the utopic peace collectives premised on civil society voluntarism that has been spurring new quest for decolonization of refugee protection framework. And it has been further evolving, Madam Chair, novel understandings for democratic citizenship, refugee identity, and human dignity. Thus, refugee migration history is replete with examples of their identity and human dignity. Therefore, humanities of the host nation states and communities. In this particular research paper, ma'am, I strive to locate the underlying universal underpinnings for just and across the board treatment of refugees to attain global utopia of peace. I argue about the centrality of refugees' utopic peace induced mobility that makes the right to utopic peace as an umbrella right whereunder all collateral, associated, vicarious, and allied rights of refugees could be accomplished consistent with the refugee voices. Because it is very unfortunate, it is very distressing to note, man, that refugees do not have their voices heard in the decision and the decisions which are generally pertaining to them. Madam Chair, this is my humble submission that humanity today in the contemporary circumstances finds itself at a trial and tribulation of unprecedented magnitude since its inception. War and conflict have crippled the humanity from continent to continent, from region to region, from country to country, where persecution of peoples based on their caste, creed, ethnicity, gender, social origin, race, religion, region, and political opinion remained unabated and continued to be made exacerbated. We have been witnessing, Madam Chair, massive violations of human rights, aggression, generalized violence, foreign occupation, domestic discrimination, and economic exclusion produced vertically, but that has been rather producing vertical divisions between rich and poor that will continue to make Afghans, Baloch, Chakma, Pakhtun, and Sri Lankans in South Asia, Hazara and Uzbeks in Central Asia, Rohingyas in Southeast Asia, Iraqis, Kurdish, and Palestinians in Middle East and Far East Asia. Whereas the Congolese, Liberians, Somalis, and Sudanese in Africa have been always vulnerable and victims. However, Chechens, Roma, Montagnards, and Ashalis displacements in Euro-Asia region have further precipitated the refugee crisis. There are many countries, Madam Chair, which have been grappling with internally displaced persons and climate refugees, as well as who are outside the protection framework of international refugee law. The persecution puts refugees in a state of denial and deprivation of basic security and safety in their country of origin. Therefore, they cannot be prevented from being refugees to refuge. They have the right to have rights, such as the right to leave and right to return under international law. The contemporary international refugee protection framework, Madam, is confronted with twofold challenges. Number one is the national security narrative. Under this particular national security narrative, host state generally benefits, interest, and responsibilities. They are going to be the casualty, and the human rights narrative, that is individual rights, right to return, etc., particularly the identity, diversity, and socio-economic progress of the refugees, that is generally contested. Today, 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees is a pillar of international refugee protection framework that is a more what you call balanced but less diversified. in the present circumstances. Despite the fact, Madam Chair, let me point out at this stage, the refugee problem has always been considered as a humanitarian issue, as a political issue. But politicality of this particular issue has been recognized by the Obama administration in 2016 under the auspices of the United Nations Organization when the New York Declaration was adopted on refugees and migrants. It was the realization on the part of the community of nation states at international level that for the first time they have realized that it is not only a humanitarian issue, but at the same time it is also having the political dynamics. And on the basis of this understanding, they came out with the idea of political solution. And the political solution was ultimately reduced into black and white in the month of December in 2018, when international community under the auspices again of United Nations organizations, they have adopted the global UN compacts on refugees, or rather I should say the global compact on refugees and the global compact on migrants. So these were the two important non-binding arrangements which came into existence, and today as many as more than 185 nation states have already acceded to these global compacts. And they have felt that there is a necessity to have a political solution of the refugees problem. And this is how they have been addressing this particular issue. But some of the provisions, it does not mean that I am underestimating the efficacy of 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees that has also completed its 70 years existence in the month of July this year. Some of the fundamental principles of 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, along with its additional protocol of 1967, has attained, in the estimation of the global North scholarship as well as the global South scholarship, there are some scholars who branded some of the provisions as the part of the just cogence or the preemptive norms of international law. Particularly Article 33 subclause 1, that is consisting of the idea of non-refoulement. Non-refoulement is a French term. It is pronounced as per the French pronunciation, but it is written in English as non-refoulement, but it is pronounced as non-refoulement. And in the subsequent convention, another important convention is sponsored by the United Nations organizations in 1984, that is Torture Convention. Article 3 of the Torture Convention is also subscribed to the idea of non-refoulement. But what we have been witnessing, we are having non-refoulement principles, we are having Torture Convention, we are having Genocide Convention, or cumulatively speaking, we are having as many as 9 core international human rights treaties, but the refugees happens to be at the receiving end. Therefore, there is a need that we must rummage the further and additional grounds, and we must also expand the institution of asylum. We should have, because one of the most important and very robust allegations against 1951 convention is that it is a convention which is Eurocentric. It is a manifestation of the Geneva-based wisdom of the global North nation states. And it has created a dichotomy. And that is why we have to resort to and to create some kind of a confluence, some kind of a compendium consisting of 1951 convention relating to the status of refugees and one side, and from the global South nation states, we have to take into account the Bangkok Declaration, Bangkok Principles on Refugees, Cartagena Declaration of 1984, and 1969 OAU Convention relating to the specific aspects of refugees. In South Asia also, All the constitutions of South Asia, whether it is the Constitution of Bangladesh, Article 31, 32, and 33 protects the refugees. Article 21 of the Maldivian Constitution also what we call, protects refugees. Article 7 of the Constitution of, Bhutan, that also protects refugees. Article again 7 of the 2004 Constitution of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, though recently it has been on 15th of August, Taliban has captured power in Afghanistan and they have declared Afghanistan as a Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. But 2004, that is the latest what we call the last Constitution of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan is also there. And Article 7 proclaims of the Constitution of Afghanistan that the government of Afghanistan will abide by and honor all its international human rights commitments, and it will honor particularly Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. So these kinds of commitments have been made, and under the umbrella of this protective shield of 9 core international human rights treaties, refugees have been promised to have protections from the repressive regimes. Because the refugees have always been fleeing persecution. And what we have been witnessing in the contemporary circumstances, where in the name of globalization, the world is being globalized. But a globalized world is also requires a constitutionalized what we call world order. And that is something which is missing. Therefore, Madam Chair, the refugee rights, or more comprehensively stating human rights, are the clothes and cloaks of civility, dignity and humanity and vision in all the national constitutions. Because when we are talking of human rights or international human rights law, I can define, I can attribute, and one word is sufficient to define entire what we call canvas of human rights, and that is human dignity. Likewise, if suppose we are talking of international humanitarian law, which is consisting of 4 Geneva Conventions on law of war of 1949 with 2 additional what we call protocols of 1977, if we want to define this entire subject matter of international humanitarian law, we can define it with one single word, and that is distinction. What we find in the law of war, that is distinction, how to use weapons, what to use and what not to be used. Same is the situation when we are talking of a utopianism of peace, euphemism of peace, across the board treatment of utopianism of peace that should be extended to the entire institution of refugeehood and how to protect what we call refugee status. That is dignity. And another important word is non-refoulement. No one should be refouled. There should not be any kind of forced deportation. There should not be any kind of involuntary repatriation of refugees to their country of origin, where they are likely to what we call confront persecution. Therefore, under the rubrics of the New York Declaration of 2016, a new narrative came into existence for the protection of refugees, and that too in a very peaceful manner. What is that? International responsibility sharing principle. International solidarity principle with the refugee hosting states. It means New York Declaration has established through the global compacts on refugees and migrants that refugee crisis or the refugee problem is an international responsibility. It does not remain the responsibility of only one country, as we have been witnessing in the Cox's Bazar area, that is the border city of Bangladesh, where the Rohingya refugees have flooded from Myanmar. More than 1 million, refugees are presently being hosted by the government of Bangladesh. But unfortunately, the political leadership of South Asia hasn't, understood the importance of ratification. Because what is important is there are benefits not to have law and there are benefits to have laws. Since 1995, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh happens to be on the executive committee of the UNHCR. That is the nodal agency under the auspices of the United Nations organizations to extend humanitarian aid and assistance to refugees. They have also, promised way back in the year 1993 that in future, these governments would definitely ratify and submit their instrument of ratification to the Secretary General of the United Nations organization, but still, they haven't kept their, promises. Because of politics-driven welfare measures, though many private members' bills have been presented before the highest parliamentary, legislative establishment in these three important nation states from South Asia. But when I see the Constitution of Germany, Constitution of Italy, particularly Article 16, subclause 2 and subclause 1 of the German Constitution, right to asylum has been recognized as a fundamental right. Even under Article 21 of the Constitution of India, Honorable Supreme Court of India on many occasions has approbated the rights, recognized the rights of refugees. It is the constitutional jurisprudence produced by national jurisdictions within the municipal legal systems that has been protecting the rights of refugees, whereas we are not having specific legislations. Because global South nation states, particularly who have been the victims of colonialism, they are still very shy. They are still very apprehensive, very reluctant to have some kind of a human rights integration with that of the world economy. So we are not witnessing that in the true sense, the human rights globalization. Globalization has taken place only in economic terms, where we find the national economies are being integrated with that of the world economy. But this is not the situation in case of human rights, in case of refugee protection, in case of the idea of refugee constitutionalism. And the institutions particularly have become subservient to their governments, because of the emergence of the right-wing nationalism or popular nationalism in each and every nation state. And diaspora in each and every geopolitical entity happens to be at the receiving end. So therefore, in these circumstances, we have to assess refugee rights. Refugees, Madam Chair, refugees are everywhere. Refugees in origins, in transitions, in migration, in remigration, in transmigration, in retransmigration, in destinations. Everywhere we find refugees since pre-socio-political demarcations. The movement for more than 80 million refugees by the end of the June 2021 across the world accentuated the indispensable international attention to the paucity of the global humanitarian system. There are questions like, how does forced migration look different if we examine it through a historical peace perspective or utopian peace perspective in consonance with the theme of this conference. How have refugees been subjugated and how they have enriched and created a peaceful atmosphere and contributed a lot in the nation building in the host societies. That particular point has never been taken care of. They are still what you call branded as suspects in the host societies. Therefore, I try to examine, Madam Chair, the dynamics of peace that illuminate our understanding of peace in the context of refugees instead of indulging in the political game of attributing, naming, and renaming human displacement in the settings of historical entanglements between migration, mobility, colonialism, race, and borders. Madam Chair, in 21st century, planet Earth has become planet refugees, as I have submitted at the very outset of my submissions. Refugees suffer from rightlessness. A state of rightlessness has been created for them. And the UNCSR, that is the United Nations sponsored Refugee Convention of 1951, is an outcome of the Europe war, not of World War. And there are reasons for myself when I believe and address the World War II or the Europe War II, because it was primarily a global war, or global north, what you call war for European refugees settlement, because the convention itself was designed how it has been adopted. Yes, ma'am.
No.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, that was me. But you can round off.
Yeah, ma'am. Just a moment. Just a moment. Give me 30 seconds, ma'am.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. You're quite passionate, but if you can round off, that'll be very good.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. When we primarily address this entire issue of refugee protection, then we should not forget the historical roots. After the conclusion of the Second World War, there was a lot of intra-European migration, and to address and to respond to the new crisis as a post-war what you call effect, the entire collective European leadership ultimately sponsored, and they came out under the auspices of the United Nations organization, this particular convention, which is known as the Refugee Convention of today. And that is 1951 convention. It was primarily designed to address the problems of European nation states' refugee exoduses, refugee influxes, and refugee mobility. When it has been felt that refugee problem has attained some international proportions, then in 1967, another important convention was, additional protocol was adopted by the United Nations organization just to remove geopolitical demarcations of 1951 convention, which was primarily a Eurocentric document. And that is why a French theorist, Hannah Arendt, has rightly pointed out that there is only in his what he call treatise that is known as totalitarianism. So she came out with this particular idea, and she was of the view, let us have, because refugees are not having one single right, and that is the most important, central, pivotal, and unprecedented kind of right, and that should be made available to them, and that is right to have rights. And still we have been grappling with this situation. So thank you very much. I will submit my full paper subsequently. Thanks a lot for providing me this opportunity and for your patience listening. Thanks a lot.
Well, Nafees, thank you. That's quite a very long presentation. Look forward to reading your paper. Yeah, refugees suffer from rightlessness. Well, that can be looked at differently by different orders. It's open for debate. Yeah, our next presenter is Melisa Martins Casagrande. I would really want to apologize to our audience and other presenters. I know Nafees presented beyond his time. I do apologize, and I hope we can be able to finish up in due time.
I'm sorry, ma'am. I tender an unconditional apology to my learned panelists and learned colleagues. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So Melisa is a researcher at the Universidade Federal de Parana. She obtained her bachelor's and master's degree in law from Universidade Federal do Parana, Brazil, and a doctorate of civil law degree from McGill University. And she actually was a postdoctoral fellow at the Universidade Federal do Parana from 2015 to 2021, where she's currently a member of several research groups and also a member of IASFM19 Conference Organizing Committee. Would like to know what IASM19 is. Melisa, you're welcome to commence your presentation.
Thank you so much, Jane. ISFM is the International Association for Forced Migration Studies.
Okay.
So we have a conference next year hosted in Brazil, where I am based, and I'm in the organizing committee of that conference.
Thank you.
So I will share my screen and hopefully you can see my presentation. Let me just move my Zoom here so that I can present in full screen. Sorry about that. Technicalities here to make the presentation full screen. There you go. I just have to move you around my screen so I can see my own screen. So my presentation is a reflection on the spirit of Cartagena. I will talk to you about what the Cartagena Declaration is further on in my presentation. But this conference has motivated us, or the topic of this conference has motivated both myself and my colleague Liliana Jubilut, who's my co-author in this paper, to reflect on the Cartagena Declaration and what we call in Latin America, the spirit of Cartagena as utopia. And in reflecting about it as utopia, if such utopia is attainable and therefore has become or can become reality, or if is merely warped humanitarianism and therefore defeats its purpose. So the 1984 Cartagena Declaration on refugees is actually the outcome of an academic colloquium that happened in Latin America to address emerging needs from intra-regional forced migration and to reflect upon certain challenges and choices on how to tackle such emerging trends of forced migration and needs for protection that had been happening in the region in the 70s and early 80s. It is a soft law document, as I mentioned, the outcome of an academic colloquium. However, it was signed by 10 states in the region. So by 10 states in Latin America, which is the place where the Cartagena Declaration has been discussed and signed. So Cartagena is a city in Colombia where the colloquium took place. And the main contribution of the 1984 Cartagena Declaration has been to acknowledge the refugee, the traditional or global concept of refugee within the region, and understanding, and we mentioned this in the paper, as has been mentioned in several presentations already, The 1951 convention, despite being global, namely after the signature or the 1967 protocol, it is a regional treaty turned global. So it was originally meant to solve a regional issue, which was European forced migration, and was turned into a global treaty, even though many countries outside Europe have participated in its negotiation, including some Latin American countries. But it was mostly to solve regional issues emerging from Europe, and therefore it became clear, both with the 1969 Convention in Africa, and later on in 1984 with the Cartagena Declaration in Latin America, that the concept of refugee needed to be expanded because it did not match emerging forced migration trends and protection needs in other regions of the world. Therefore, the Cartagena Declaration expands the legal concept of refugee. It embraces the existing concept, and the declaration actually mentions the 1951 and 1951 Convention and 1967 Protocol, but it expands the concept, the legal concept, the legal category of refugee, with a concept based on granting refugee status or processing refugee status determination on the basis of massive violations of human rights, or as the formula has become known, gross and generalized human rights violations. In addition to bringing this new category that, rather than focus on the individual being persecuted and the protection needed for that individual being persecuted, it focuses on the circumstances that cause the displacement, which matches or suits much more efficiently the protection needs arising in Latin America, both back then and up until now. So it is one of its main contributions, as well as an approach since its inception that promotes a dialogue between international refugee law and international human rights law. So a dialogue has always existed prior to the Cartagena Declaration, and it has motivated it with the Cartagena Declaration and also following the Cartagena Declaration. It is an interesting system, and the term Spirit of Cartagena is actually an existing and widely used term in the region. It's not something we came up for the paper, because when we talk about Cartagena and the Spirit of Cartagena with people from outside the region, some people who are not as familiar with it think, well, it sounds very ethereal, it sounds very out of this world, very utopian. Did you come up with it? No, it's actually a term that has been used since its inception, since the inception of the declaration, and mirrors a number of factors that I'll mention later on in my presentation. So it exists, it's widely used, like the term Spirit of Cartagena is widely used by legislators, by authors, researchers, policymakers, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And the Spirit of Cartagena is not merely the 1984 declaration. It looks both backwards and also forwards. I've exemplified here in my slide the Cartagena Declaration in the middle, the document, the declaration from 1984. And I've placed those two examples of manifestations of the Spirit of Cartagena, or things that either motivated it or were enabled by it, which are existing historical treaties in Latin America on asylum, both diplomatic asylum and political asylum. And just to give an example, and I put here the picture of the International Court of Justice judgment on asylum. It's a very emblematic case from 1951. It is a dispute between two Latin American countries on the interpretation of a 1928 regional treaty on asylum. So it builds upon this tradition of asylum in the region since the beginning of the 20th century, or even the late 19th century. And and it carries on looking to the future with a procedure foreseen in the Cartagena Declaration, or a process foreseen in the Cartagena Declaration, of a review of the process of the Spirit of Cartagena every 10 years. And unlike many treaties, when these reviews are foreseen but not necessarily occur, this process has been quite successful in Latin America in relation to the Spirit of Cartagena, or the Declaration of Cartagena, or Cartagena process. The Spirit of Cartagena, it implies, and so it's not merely the treaty and what the treaty says, but what it builds upon and what it has triggered, as I mentioned before. So it implies and enables the creation and expansion of a humanitarian space in the region with solidarity as a basis of practice. So it expands the concept of refugee, but it also creates an ethos of humanitarianism in the region, which has enabled later not only the expansion of the refugee definition in state practice in several countries in the region, it has also encouraged and made happen in several states additional pathways for protection. An example are humanitarian visas, who have been granted, created and granted across Latin America since then. And also resettlement programs intra-region from migrants from within the region, but also from outside the region, which are tabled and promoted as resettlement in solidarity. So in Latin America, instead of talking about burden sharing or responsibility sharing, it's a resettlement in solidarity, which bears that same spirit, that same objective, but embedded within the Spirit of Cartagena, which brings a humanitarian space and an expanded definition of protection in the region. As I mentioned before, dialogue, it presupposes a dialogue between human rights and refugee protection, granting rights to persons not necessarily encompassed within the traditional concept of refugee, offering additional pathways for protection, but also keeping in mind an integral protection approach, which is to grant rights based on the migratory status, but also rights based on the condition of the person as a human being. And it has indeed, it's a soft law document, the outcome of an academic colloquium, but because it built upon existing practice and it has grown and developed since then, it has shaped state practice as the expanded refugee definition has been incorporated into domestic legislation by 16 states. So the original declaration was signed by 10 states, but its outcome and its proposed expanded definition of refuge has been incorporated into 16 states' domestic legislation. I'll give you an example. Brazil has legislation from 1997. So the refugee law is from 1997. It applies this expanded definition of refugee. And in the first 20 years of implementation of the law of refugee status determination in Brazil from 1997 to 2017, 65% of refugee status determination, so persons who became refugees in Brazil, the motivation for the refugee status determination has been gross and generalized human rights violations. So within the expanded refugee definition. Another example from Brazil, which is where we practice, in 2017 alone, 94% of persons coming from Syria that have been recognized as refugees in Brazil, have been declared refugees in Brazil, 94% have been declared refugees on the basis of the expanded definition. So it also encompasses, so the Spirit of Cartagena implies and enables periodic reviews so that look into the future to assess the region's needs in forced migration. So it foresees those 10-year reviews to evaluate developments and adopt follow-up documents. And I'm almost wrapping up my presentation because I understand my time is nearly up. So we see a growing adhesion or enthusiasm for the Spirit of Cartagena and for this expanded definition, with 17 countries signing into Cartagena plus 10, 20 into Cartagena plus 20, and 31 into Cartagena plus 30. And not only has it maintained the expanded refugee definition, but plus 10 deals with issues relating to IDPs, which was an incoming and growing concern in the region at the time in 1994, when plus 10 was signed, statelessness and resettlement in 2004, and most recently forced migration from outside the region to the region in 2014. And into my last slide, the reflections that we have of the Spirit of Cartagena as an utopian framework of protection. Considering renewed protection challenges within and outside the region, have continuously tested this humanitarian framework. We have posed ourselves two questions in this paper. If the regional humanitarian ideals have been attained by the legal protection solutions brought forth by the Spirit of Cartagena, turning utopia into reality, or if the legal protection solutions have been warped under the guise of humanitarian spirit, corrupting its humanitarian nature. And it is a work in progress, but so far the answer to both questions has been yes. So at the same time, we have a scenario where findings in jurisprudence from the Inter-American Commission and Inter-American Court of Human Rights have motivated some of the conclusions of Cartagena, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights have continued to use all the set of documents that have emerged from this process within its jurisprudence, having issued several consultative opinions and having one case that deals specifically with refugee rights, having used heavily this Spirit of Cartagena, promoting, therefore, the ideas proposed in it in this expanded concept of refugees, the protection that has been granted to, particularly to Syrians and Venezuelans migrating to the region or within the region through both refugee status determination, but also alternative pathways for protection, such as humanitarian visas. We can see that it has indeed turned this utopia of a humanitarian space into a reality. However, paradoxically, the response to Venezuelan migration, with the increase of anti-migrant discourses, both by public authorities and the media within the region, and also other difficulties that have emerged in the political and social spectrum in Latin America, have been detrimental to a full implementation of the Spirit of Cartagena. And this humanitarianism has been used as the core or the motivation for certain measures. However, the results have not been as positive as we had seen before in other initiatives. So we see the case of migration from Afghanistan and the possibility of humanitarian visas for Afghan nationals, and things are not as straightforward as they have been for other humanitarian visas that have been created. And also renewed challenges from the Venezuelan migration within the region have demonstrated that this framework of protection has not been as effective as it could have been. So I apologize for passing 2 minutes of my time of presentation, and I'll leave here my details, my email. So if you have further questions or would like to see any more information or previous publications that we have on this topic, I'd be happy to send them along. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Melisa. Yeah, please. I would like all the presenters to turn on their cameras. Mehmoona, Madison, Nafees, and Melisa. These are very insightful presentations, and wow, we already got some questions coming up. Yeah. So our first question is for, well, this if you have not sent your question on chat, if you want to ask it verbally, yes, you can. If you just raise your hands, there is the reactions. You can put up your hands and I would call on you. So our first question is for Melisa. I've always been curious to know to what extent the Cartagena, pardon me, the Cartagena Declaration has had any impact on US and Canadian interpretations of regional displacements, given their role in the Organization of American States, but not, I don't think, as signatories to or adopters of the Cartagena Declaration.
All right, thank you so much for this question, Julie. And I think this kind of reflection is one of the reasons why we wanted to bring this particular topic to this particular conference. Unfortunately, in our opinion, not enough. So not a big impact on regional policies as a whole, on continental policies, so to say, or even migration from Latin America to North America, which is quite considerable. So we do have a lot of mobility within Latin America, but there's also significant mobility to the United States and Canada. So it is interesting because the trigger to the academic colloquium was specifically migration from Central America to North America. And it was to provide additional pathways for protection and to provide standards that were suitable regionally that the Cartagena process came about. And it has had a much bigger impact from the US-Mexican border down than it has from the US-Mexican border up. But especially the renewed dialogues, +10, +20, +30, and hopefully +40 in 2024, which is coming up. And it will be very interesting to see what comes up as challenges that the region is facing. It would be very interesting to see a bigger engagement within the OAS, but also international cooperation, considering migration has increased. And we can work together as countries in the continent to provide more effective solutions. And it's interesting how in Latin America, we look to some of the Canadian solutions as alternatives. So it would be nice to see the other way around as well. Not that the process is perfect and not that it provides solutions to all the problems, far from it, but seeing and knowing both systems or both regimes, there could be a much bigger dialogue than it exists at the moment, I believe. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you, Melisa. Is there any question from Mehmoona, Nafees, and Madison? You can actually ask your questions verbally.
If no one else has questions, I have a question for Melisa as well. So I know just from as part of the research I'm a part of, we also research in Colombia. And I know that during the Venezuelan migration situation that there has been more, I guess, restraints placed on the Colombian media to be very aware of the message that you're putting out to the population to try to limit any type of ethnic conflict that there would be. And I'm not super familiar with the Cartagena Declaration. So do you think that this policy was in part inspired by that declaration? And if so, is that applicable to other countries within Latin America as well?
I think, thank you for that question. I think because it is a process and because the spirit kind of lives on, it does bring change, not only to legislation through state practice, but it also brings change to all the stakeholders involved in the processes of migration, because it's so ingrained into practice of civil society. It's such a framework, both for states and for civil society and for other stakeholders, that it could well have had an influence. The process has developed quite a lot in terms of like +20, +30. when not only we have declarations, but also plans of action. And in the plans of action, there are specific issues addressed, including guidelines for the type of situation or perception you describe. So it could be that it has been used as a framework, as a guideline, but it could also be an overall characteristic that we see. It's very interesting, and it's very interesting that it is a document that brings the name of a Colombian city and is forever attached to Colombia, because 94 and the issue of IDPs, it was mostly brought forth into the Latin American system because of the Colombian displacement. And further on, other issues that ended up happening and being brought into the process, including Venezuelan migration to several countries, one of the most significant flows being precisely to Colombia. So I think it's those lessons learned, but it's also a Colombian characteristic of lived experience as a country, and we can tie into Mehmoona's trauma research and how that plays out and which countries bring forth certain issues. And I think one of the biggest successes of the Spirit of Cartagena being so alive is the fact that during the 80s, many Latin American countries had dictatorships, and there was a lot of forced migration because of those dictatorships and that trauma, which led to a process of solidarity and hospitality that is not necessarily present in other parts of the world. However, that history is more and more distant, and we are seeing precisely the problems that generated the need for those solutions all over again.
Thank you.
With the permission of chair, may I, Miss Melisa, thank you very much for a very excellent and enlightening, intellectual treat on this occasion. I would like to know as a researcher, because presently I am working on this particular issue of IDPs, internally displaced persons. So, Madam, I would like to know your viewpoint. Do you propose or do you foresee any feasibility or any potentiality to have an international full-fledged treaty, binding treaty on internally displaced persons instead of 1998 guidelines on UN guidelines on internal displacement, or on the lines of the Kampala Convention on internal displacement adopted by the African Union in 2009. What do you say? Thank you.
Thank you for that very interesting question. I believe we are further and further in the global arena from binding conventions and treaties on the different issues and all the forcibly displaced people who require protection, people and peoples who require protection, international protection. So I am a big enthusiast, and the paper here demonstrates that, of regional solutions and of and as much as binding solutions are very important, I think the lesson learned from the Cartagena process is that you can have a non-binding group of declarations and a non-binding process that is more binding in the region than some of the very binding treaties. So that's, for me, that's it. It's regional approaches and soft law could be a way forward, and Cartagena is a good example of how that can work when there is the political and the social will for it.
Okay, thank you, presenters.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, audience. We have just 1 minute to go. So I had a comment. Yeah, it's been a very insightful session from Mehmoona's research on trauma, medicines on settlement, and Nafees on so passionate about refugees suffering from rightlessness and discussing the international responsibilities, sharing principles, and then the spirit of Cartagena. I'll keep practicing how to say that.
You're doing a great job.
Okay, so we would end the session today. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, our audience, for being part of this session. And if you want to read more about those presentations, I know you have papers on it. I believe that we can get it from the association, probably their website, or somehow we would definitely get it because it's quite exciting papers and insightful for us to understand what is going on in this utopia and practice of refugee practices. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.